Ready or not, the October 2023 changes are here. But no worries, I got you covered. Stick around for an overview of the changes that you'll need to know to jump into October like a boss.
No Stress, MDS, with Mike D. Taking the stress out of MDS, one puzzle piece at a time.
Hey everyone, welcome to No Stress MDS. My name is Mike D. I'm a registered nurse and MDS coordinator. And here on my channel, it's my goal to provide relevant and engaging videos with tutorials, tips, and tricks that will help you take the stress out of MDS one puzzle piece at a time. I'm sure you've already heard the buzz, but in case you haven't, CMS recently released the final version of the updated REI manual, which goes into effect this October. The revisions made this year came with considerable changes, including the long-awaited departure of Section G, the inclusion of several new standardized patient assessment data elements, also known as FADEs, a revision to the pain and PHQ interviews, a makeover to Section N, and that's just to name a few. Along with the major changes came your typical REI updates to address spelling errors, grammatical errors, updating of terminology, and simple rephrasing throughout the manual. While this video does not cover all the changes, it will cover the most notable changes coming our way. To conform with the 2011 Health and Human Services Data Standards, CMS modified and added items to include the reporting of several different social determinants of health. In addition to these items, CMS also made several other revisions to the MDS in an effort to further comply with the mandates outlined in the IMPACT Act, which requires standardized patient assessment data elements to be collected across the post-acute care continuum. If you're interested in learning more about the IMPACT Act and what it means for you as an MDS coordinator, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click the notifications bell, as we'll be discussing this in a future video. There were many changes to Section A in this update, including the removal of item A1000 race ethnicity and the addition of data elements A1005 ethnicity and A1010 race. So essentially, CMS separated the one item A1000 into two. These two data elements are considered new resident interview items, which are intended to further increase the resident's voice throughout the assessment process. For each of these items, assessors will now collect information using a one-question multi-response check all that applies format to record the resident's interview responses regarding their ethnicity and racial background. Assessors must ask these questions during the observation period of the corresponding assessment, and like the other resident interview items, the resident responses can be coded directly on the MDS. If the resident is unable to respond to these questions, assessors are allowed to ask family members, significant others, guardians, or legally authorized representatives these questions. Only if the resident is unable to respond and these four individuals are not available can the medical record then be referenced. MDS coordinators must also be aware of the step for assessment, which states if the resident declines to respond, assessors are not to code based on any other resources, but instead code response Y, resident declines to respond. So what should we do with this new information that we're collecting about our residents? Well, we need to keep in mind that the true intent for these two new data elements is to collect information that will aid us in developing a culturally competent care plan that will help improve the quality of care and overall health outcomes for our residents. CMS also introduced data element A1250, transportation. This item requires facilities to assess a resident's access to transportation for ongoing health care and medication needs. Like the race ethnicity items, A1250 is another interview question, and the resident's responses can be directly coded on the MDS. It is to be assessed upon admission and discharge for residents utilizing the Medicare Part A benefit, as this item will be found on the Medicare 5-day item set and the planned over discharges when also coded as a SNF Part A PPS discharge. The assessors should ask the resident if in the past 6 months to a year has lack of transportation kept them from medical appointments or from getting their medications, and if in the past 6 months to a year has lack of transportation kept them from non-medical meetings, appointments, work, or from getting things that they need. For this item, if the resident is unable to respond to these questions, assessors are allowed to ask family members, significant others, guardians, or legally authorized representatives. And only if the resident is unable to respond and one of the four individuals are not available can the medical record then be referenced. And like the race ethnicity coding instructions, if the resident declines to respond, assessors are not to code based on any other resources, but instead code response Y, resident declines to respond. Facilities should use this information to facilitate better coordination in discharge planning by identifying barriers that may be present upon discharge. The next social determinant of health item that CMS introduced will be found in Section B. Facilities will begin collecting data regarding the resident's health literacy by coding data element B1300. Like our transportation item, this information will only be collected upon admission and discharge for our residents in a Medicare Part A stay. It is also another interview item, and assessors again should ask the resident the health literacy interview question during the observation window of the assessment, and responses may be coded directly in the MDS. Assessors will ask the resident how often does the resident need to have someone help them when they read instructions, pamphlets, or other written material from their doctor or pharmacy, and to code the resident's response to be either never, rarely, sometimes, often, always, resident declines to respond, or resident is unable to respond. And unlike the previous items discussed so far, assessors are not permitted to obtain this information from any other source, as this item is intended to be a resident self-report item only. The last social determinant of health item added to the MDS is item D0700, social isolation. This item is another interview item which must be completed within the observation period. Like the transportation item, this item is intended to be a resident self-report item only. No other source should be used to identify the response. Assessors are instructed to ask the resident how often do they feel lonely or isolated from those around them, and to code the resident's response to be either never, rarely, sometimes, often, always, resident declines to respond, or resident is unable to respond. Facilities should use the information collected on this item to help facilitate and identify residents who may be feeling lonely and who might benefit from engagement efforts. One of the biggest changes taking place this October is the merging of Section G and GG. This change will impact how quality measures are calculated, how CAs are triggered, and will also have a significant impact on workflow for facilities in case mix states. Starting in October, Section GG will include the functional limitation in range of motion and mobility device used items which are currently found in Section G. No changes were made to the steps for assessment or coding instructions for these items, so assessors will likely not need to worry about their current process for obtaining this data. CMS also introduced two new functional ability items, and that's the self-care item GG0130I, personal hygiene, and the mobility item GG0170FF, tub shower transfer. You may find the definition of personal hygiene to be familiar, and that's because it was literally pulled from Section G. Tub transfer, however, is a newer ADL and is defined as involving the ability to get into and out of the tub or shower, and it does not include washing, rinsing, drying, or any other bathing activities in this item. The updated REI also contains additional clarifications as well as changes to the observation periods for the self-care and mobility items. The 3-day observation period for the standalone OBRA admission assessment is now the first 3 days since admission, so that's the date of admission plus 2 days. The other OBRA required assessments continue to have a 3-day observation period of ARD minus 2 days, unless combined with a 5-day assessment or an end of Medicare Part A assessment, in which case the first 3 days or the last 3 days of the Part A stay would make up the corresponding window. CMS also revised other parts of Section GG in the REI manual and added several much needed clarifications throughout the section. If you haven't already, I highly recommend reviewing the Section GG change tables found in the updated REI manual to make sure you are aware of all the changes that were made. Another change that's coming this October is the removal of item N0410, medications received, and the addition of N0415, high-risk drug classes, use and indication. Assessors will no longer be required to count the number of days a resident received a medication from the current list of 8 medication classes, but instead will code all high-risk medications according to classification that were received at any time during the observation period. Additionally, assessors will also code if there is an indication noted for the medications in the drug class. Coordinators need to be aware of what CMS defines as a med indication. In the REI, it is defined as being the identified, documented clinical rationale for administering a medication that is based upon a physician's or prescriber's assessment of the resident's condition and therapeutic goals. 2 additional drug classes were also added to the current list of high-risk medications, and this includes antiplatelets and hypoglycemics. There were several other clarifications added throughout Section N, including the directive to not code in this section flushes that were given to keep an IV site patent. If you haven't already, I highly recommend you take a look at the Section N change tables found at the end of the revised REI manual. CMS also made changes this year to 2 of the scripted interviews, Section J's pain interview and Section D's PHQ-9, which is now called the PHQ-229. There were several revisions made to Section J to enhance clarity in the steps for assessment and the coding instructions. The interview questions and response coding had several changes, including the renumbering and changing of item responses for frequency of pain, where now the response for almost constantly is a 4 instead of a 1, which it has been for the past several years. CMS also removed interview items J0500A and J0500B, and added interview items J0510, J0520, and J0530. J0510 still requires us to ask the resident if pain had any impact on sleep, but instead of a yes or no response, we now capture the frequency for how often pain impacted sleep during the 5-day period. This is similar to the 2 new questions J0520 and J0530, where interviewers will ask the resident if pain limited their participation in therapy and non-therapy activities. But again, instead of a yes or no response, the resident will report the frequency in which this occurred during the 5-day period. CMS also revised Section D and the instructions for conducting the PHQ. These changes were made to promote alignment with other post-acute care settings with the cross-setting data elements. The new guidance for D0100, should resident mood interview be conducted, states that if a resident cannot communicate, then the staff mood interview should be conducted unless the assessment being completed is a standalone Part A PPS discharge assessment. If that is the case, then skip to D0700, social isolation. The most notable change to this section is that assessors are now required to ask the resident the first 2 questions of the PHQ-2, and depending on their responses, the assessor may not need to ask the remaining 7 questions to conduct the full PHQ-2-9 interview. The instructions for this interview now state that if both D0150A1 and D0150B1 are coded 9, or both D0150A2 and D0150B2 are coded 0 or 1, the assessor should then end the PHQ interview. For all other scenarios, the assessor should proceed to ask the remaining 7 questions, which are D0150C to D0150I of PHQ-9, and complete D0160, the total severity score. Another interesting thing to note regarding the changes made to the pain interview and PHQ is that CMS removed the statements from the manual, which stated that it was preferable for the interviews to be conducted on the ARD or 1 day before. If you were in the practice of conducting these interviews on the ARD or a day before, know now that you really have the freedom to complete these interviews anytime during the observation period. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel and clicking the notifications bell so that you can receive alerts whenever I upload new videos. October changes, we're ready for you.